Well, I mean, something more specific about the treatment. We want to see, you know. Oh, I'm sorry. Just didn't do what Paul told us to do. I mean, in the sense that right now it's talking, I mean, I really feel like the small area plans are focusing on larger mixed use, you know, consolidation into larger mixed use projects, a la what happened, you know, Founders Row that spans the full width of Park, Broad to Park. But in these areas of T, at least, you know, on the Park Avenue portion, you know, the lots typically are not going to, they don't span that. Even with consolidation, they're not going to do that. And it doesn't seem like the comp plan, you know, and what's come from council as far as this, you know, the whole idea of this T-zone. I mean, I don't see anything in the small area plan that talks about, you know, missing middle and talking about that aspect of it. So that's all I meant to say. I'm not saying it's completely, there's no guidance whatsoever. I mean, you know, we do have an adopted map and plans, but I'm just saying, you know, the message that kind of came or was telegraphed through what council referred out didn't seem to sync up with it as well as I would have normally expected to see, in my opinion, like it did. You know, like when we looked at these other mixed-use projects, I don't think we've ever questioned sort of the comp plan. Like when we've evaluated you know, Broad and Washington, we've evaluated Founders Row 1 and, you know, well, I wasn't here for 1, but Founders Row 2. I think on those projects, I mean, it was very clear that we felt that it was consistent, whereas this proposed change to the ordinance, which typically would be implementing the comp plan, just doesn't seem to be, I just don't see enough of the, you know, that it's backed up as much as I would like it to by the comp plan. So that's just the way I've read it, unless I'm missing something in there that, you know, gets to that. But when, you know, as far as the small area plan goes, I just don't think it addresses what we're trying to do or what we sort of think we were told to do with the T-zones.
I think when I think of it, like there's the small area plans, and there's also the chapters of the comprehensive plan, and the housing chapter which just updated. I was just brought that up because the vision is create and maintain a diverse supply of housing that supports an inclusive and welcoming community as the region continues to grow, work proactively to ensure affordable housing keeps pace with population increases, and is available for a range of incomes, household sizes, generations, and needs. And to me, like, I think that some of what I'd like to see happen in transition zones is providing that diversity of housing types for people of all different ages. You know, I'd like to see like accessibility requirements potentially. That's something that we had talked about previously. So we have like some percentage of units that are use universal design criteria, so people can age in place in the community and downsize. Like that's, and I think that is supported, you know, in some of the chapters of the plan. But I think you're right that the small area plan for T zones, and I reviewed that too, and it struck me as very broad and a very large and differing area too. So I think you're right about that. But when you think about the places where you could have those kinds of small developments, you know, the T zones are a natural fit.
I guess the one thing I would add, Rob, as I think about your question and Brent's reply, is that, you know, the comp plan and small area plans do discuss transition zones and their role. So I guess my guidance on that was that to the degree that we start changing the rules, that it kind of has to stay within the spirit of what is there now. If we want to go beyond that, and I guess in my view, what the council came out with in terms of the first reading, because of opening the spigot, as I call it, and making it a lot more desirable for economic development, it begins to, in my mind, mold out of that role of the little bit of transition that is discussed in the plan. So that's as much as I got out of it. I don't disagree with anything Brent said, though, that ideally, in an ideal world, we'd start out with changing the comprehensive plan, have the public discussion, input, all of that take place, clear goals, you know, so all of that is stated, and then move into the zoning code. If you do try to do it backward, as we've kind of done it here, it obviously, you know, raises some more challenges. I don't know.
How about the future land use act that has mixed use? So it's not changing the rules, it's what it's.
Right, that's just.
we're looking at these targeted areas, I mean, I think that's where, you know, I think we're missing it. But I mean, you know, in our role, I think we're kind of dealt the card, we have the cards, we have to play the cards we're dealt and give back to council our suggestions and recommendations based on that. And I guess, you know, perhaps they'll consider the comp plan changes, but if not, you know, if they're going to, you know, look at changing the ordinance, I mean, I think we, you know, need to look at things that are more in line, as Tim said, with what's there today. Because if you go too far out from that, you know, again, you're kind of like you're building a pier and without any supports under it, and at some point it falls. So, anyhow, so that's what I was getting at.
Okay. Should we maybe see if we want to add anything to the list there? I can certainly start out. You have uses, and one of the things that I want to talk about this evening is the by right uses that are currently in the council proposal and the staff additions.
Yeah, I'm running out of.
You want to put them up here, Paul?
Yeah.
Yeah. Put them up in this corner.
Sure. I took a training actually, and they talked about the importance of banners
Oh yeah.
and boxes, so I practiced a little bit. Excuse me.
Okay, so the one I had was clarification of the existing by right uses.
Can we add another one? Do you want?
Add that or? Memory man.
That's what the markers for.
Because what we're going to do, I think, is after we're done adding topics, then we'll just go through them and ask our questions or make our comments.
But to me, like, the purpose and the comp plan is like direct link to what's by right and what goes through special use permit.
Right.
Mapping those things together. We want more housing. Let's make it easy. That's not what this is about.
That's kind of the broader issue. What I had in mind is just very specific things that are there and just asking some questions about it to clarify what it is. But somebody else want to add? I've got some more that
My questions are more specific about some of the changes that were in here around parking and the HCC. I just want some clarity. I don't know if they rise to the level of these big topics. But
Now, you said H.
the historic
Oh.
cultural conservation overlay.
I have a question about the 1 acre threshold. To what specifically it applies.
I have a question on the SUP process. Try to flesh that out. Speak up as people have. I've got some more.
We can always add more. I've got like a whole box of markers.
I've got questions from the staff, the staff report. I don't know if you want to just put that in as.
Oh, sure. Sure.
And you don't have to write this down, but just as an example, what's meant by no residential uses north of Great Falls on North Washington. It'd be good to get your kind of expert interpretation of what that means. There's some others in there too, but that one. jumped out.
I took some leeway and I merged it with sort of the Park Ave discussion because it gets to, I think, sort of different areas of the city and what's the structure.
Right.
You mentioned setbacks.
Yeah,
Is
we've
that
got,
a scale? Yeah, I was going to ask the same question. Can we talk about that when we talk about scale?
a few others, but they all fit under that, I think. Are we ready to start going into the individual topics?
Yeah, where do we start?
Scale? That's okay. You want to start there? Well, the one that's in the plan already is the rear yard setback, which I guess the thing that struck me as really worthy of being pointed out is under the current code, somebody could build a parking lot and put it right up on the property line under today's rules. And under what we're talking about here, we're saying at a minimum there has to be 20 feet on that rear yard setback. So, that's an improvement, I guess, depending on your perspective. But I think it's an improvement over what's in the existing code today.
I think somebody could actually build a 3-story, 45-foot office building by right today
Am I
in
right,
the
Paul?
T
Any of
zones
the by
with
right
no
uses,
setback.
other than the housing options, could go right up to the property line at the maximum height that's allowed.
Yeah, Mr. Trainer, I think you're going forward. It's the comparison table of what can be done today. So actually, Mr. Trainer, I think you actually assembled this table, so maybe I'll flip it over to you. If you can walk through sort of what's allowable in T-zones, how does that relate to sort of setbacks, and then I think that table might have been you've got an even better table. I'll let you do it.
Yeah, so this is the table comparing setback and heights with T-zones as councils referred them, and then in the staff report we have kind of as they are today. But for B1 and T-zones as they are today, there's no rear setback unless they abut a residential district.
Right.
Was that in your other table? Can you go back to the one in the staff report, actually?
Yeah. Let me keep this one open as another tab.
Yeah, so it's that T1 all other uses and T2 all other uses. You can see that rear setback requirement is none unless footnote 1 is met, and that's the adjacency to R1A, R1B. And so sort of the question was correct that an all commercial building could be built on the lot line to the maximum allowable height of 45 feet.
Can I just jump in with a few use cases here? Because here's where it's like we have to look at it in totality. Obviously, that very attractive lack of setback is not enticing a lot of development here, right? And I have a feeling there's a bunch of things going on that drives that. One of which might be lot coverage, right? One of which might be the fact that you can only build 3 stories. Maybe, the new proposed ordinance is 4 stories. So whether it's 60% or 80%, there's still, I think, more space. It's hard for me to do the math here in the abstract, but at the very least, with 4 stories, you've got more leasable space, so maybe it's more attractive. And so that's where I really think we have to unpack scale, lot size, in the context of all other uses, right? And is this, and marry that up with what are developers actually going to do? Because if we're putting together some algebra here that's going to lead to continued lack of development or gangbusters development that doesn't match what our 2012 small area plan tells us we want in our report, then that's just, I don't know. It's hard to sort of process this, I think. And so, I would just love to list my use cases and then just shut up, because then the scale and the likelihood matters, and I think in that more context, right? Like,
So you want to leave the
Right.
scale and go to
well, I
another one?
think it's like scale of what, right?
Yeah.
Scale of the all of it uses. Like,
I mean,
we have parking lots,
I get your frustration,
Right.
but I guess you build a building a brick at a time, right? So you
Yeah.
kind of have to.
we've got parking lots that are available now, right?
Yeah.
So they're not being built, right? But if we think in the context
Well,
of that
there's
little.
one behind the hotel there. That's right on Park Avenue.
The garage for the hotel, yeah.
Right.
To me, I mean, I think the big difference here is that we would be allowing residential, which is what the market wants to build. So nothing's being built because nobody wants to build office, nobody wants to build commercial, they want to build residential. So you would get things built if you allow residential to be built. So what would we want it to look like? If we allow residential, what do you want that building form to look like? What do you want the setbacks to be? How big do you want it to be? Right? Like, I think if you allow residential, you're going to get it. So how do we want it to, how do we want it to be?
So can we talk about like two examples? A 4-story commercial only.
What is that though? I just don't know what that,
Offices, dental, medical, I don't really
the
know.
offices can be built today and nobody's building them.
Nobody's building them. My question to developers is, does the scale configuration, the lot configuration, and the 4 stories make it more likely?
Yeah,
Or
I don't,
not?
that might be a
I
question
don't
for
know.
staff to ask the developers community.
Because
I
what
don't
I'm
know.
hearing from some of the public comments is we're allowing a whole bunch of stuff by right. There's a lot of stuff that's already allowed by right. Parking, lots, offices, boarding houses, inns. I've got the list that's not being built because something about this zoning is not making that enticing, in addition to the current market. So there's a lot of factors. Do these changed configurations alone, the new scale and the new lot configuration, is there something about that alone that would allow those currently allowed by right uses to start happening? And these commercial only, or like, could you have a 3-story building, 3-story office, 3-story commercial only building, ground floor restaurant, top 2 floors are more dental offices, right? Because that seemed to me by right. And so what does that scale look like? Is that going to happen? And then more likely, we have a 3-story building that's like ground floor bakery and then 2 floors apartments, right? And so what does the scale, does this configuration allow for more of that? And so to me, like, scale in the absence of use is hard to process. That's
Like, is it
Is it likely? So, Mike, is it feasible? Right. Let's talk about the use case of ground floor restaurant, bookstore, something wonderful, and 2 floors of. Or let's talk about three stories above that of apartments. Is that?
So none of the above, like today, none of that could be.
None of that would happen.
Correct.
And the next, and then in the new ordinance, it would.
Maybe. I think it would probably be all
But it's
residential.
Permissible. Is it
I
permissible?
had to guess.
Have to be
Right.
under an acre, right?
Under an acre.
Yeah. So you can have the special use permit process.
So if somebody wanted to take the 1.6 acre zone on Park and buy that whole thing and put mixed use apartments and bakeries
Yep.
or restaurants or bookshops.
They're under the
that
special
can't
exception
happen.
rezoned to be.
Then it has to be rezoned.
And I think the market just doesn't want to build that. I think right now, I mean, developers couldn't probably get financing to do that on Park because you don't have the trips passing by. Retail's so fickle, and it's also a very difficult landscape these days. I mean, essentially what happened, we see it. I mean, this is true all throughout the region. I mean, it's the apartments are essentially subsidizing some of the ground floor retail. And so that's what you would see. I mean, at best, I mean, it'd be mostly multi-family. I mean, there'd be an appetite for more apartments, but probably not for a lot of, certainly not for office. I mean, a spec office. I can't remember the last time I saw a spec office building get built anywhere around here. And so, I think that's the challenge. I mean, the market, for those types of uses, especially on a street like Park, I think is going to be limited. Now, on North Washington, I think perhaps, but although even there, the retail landscape is tough. We see that, work going on Broad too at Founders Row. So I think that's the difficult thing, but I think as far as, well, I mean, again, I sound like a broken record, but we're, without sort of stronger guidance as far as like what we want to do. Right now, the comp plan map says mixed use. Is mixed use really achievable, on Park for lots that are just fronting on Park, not lots that go through, that are just, consolidating just some of the existing lots that are only on Park or on some of the other, side streets. I don't know. And so, again, we're being tasked with trying to craft an ordinance that, comp plan. But, I mean, I think the market wants to build townhouses there, and that's not a bad thing. There are other, especially if we could achieve other goals, like affordable housing and or, providing housing types, in a different income strata. But yeah, so I don't know. I mean, again, it's hard to, I mean, I think I said this at one of the earlier meetings. I mean, there's so few T zones. We could almost take each site one by one and try to, we could certainly, kind of look at like, do an exercise and see what might fit on that lot and what makes sense. And it also kind of speaks to why, at minimum, a special permit process, if not, a more robust process, is probably it's also probably a good idea, on these projects. But yeah, I think it's hard to come up with some of these ideas, and if they're, I just think some of them are just not realistic to think that there's going to be a lot of non-residential on some of those lots, that there'll be an appetite for it.
I guess the assumption at the moment is assuming, for the moment, and you're kind of pushing back on this, but if you could, assume that you've got to build a project that is going to come forward. Okay. With that, are you okay with, setback 20 foot in the rear with total coverage at 60% rather than 80%, with 3 stories facing the street with a step back, to allow a 4th story? So I guess that's the question now. Realizing that you'd have to come back and answer your higher level question, which is, will this even get built at this point?
What and where,
Yeah,
right?
right.
What is it? And where is it being built? Like which of our T zones? Is it Park or is it North Washington? Right? So, I mean, I sure. That looks good to me. But, I mean, if we think about the 1.6 acre lot zone on Park Avenue, just very specifically, here's my question. It's a 1.6 acre T zone, the map, with the proposed, let's say, if hypothetically somebody thought it would be amazing to take that lot and build only commercial on it, only commercial, 4 stories, ground floor, some amazing maker space, ground floor bookstores, bakeries, restaurants, going to be so great, bunch of dental offices. Is that permissible by right under this T zone if it's over an acre? This is where like my acre question. It is permissible.
Well, it's permissible
By right.
now, in the sense that someone could, if someone bought that land, they could consolidate it, they could develop it under a site plan today, and at 40% lot coverage, and they could stick a parking lot on the other 60%. They could stick nothing but dental lot. They could.
So can we just pull it that a little? So today,
Although I don't know that dental offices are allowed, so that the uses may
it says
limit.
medical.
Oh, sure, then
It says,
you're all
yeah,
set.
so today, you could have a 1.6 acres, like 40% of 1.6 acres, that's only office. You can't have the restaurant, right?
Correct.
You can't have the bakery.
Correct.
You cannot have the shoe store, the antique store, the barber shop, the neighborhood serving retail, office only.
Can you be that rigid, though? I mean, even under today's rules, it may not be specified in the zoning. It's not to say they couldn't come in and ask for it and that the city would allow it.
What would it take?
But I think the question is, what's allowable by right today?
By right.
Okay.
What's allowable by
One
right?
thing that may be helpful, this is a little bit different from what's by right today, but we do have sort of examples of what sort of doesn't work. They're in the, Mr. Trainer, if you go to,
The 2 developments, the one on Spring Street.
yeah,
and
the
other
ones that
on
didn't,
Park
oh,
and
I'm
Way.
sorry.
Yeah, I guess it's just just to pull that thread to the end of that one piece of it is it's allowable by right today. It's not happening. Does increasing the lot coverage and increasing the number of floors make it more likely? That's my question to developers, right?
So
By right.
sure. So what we've seen from development inquiries, right? People come into the planning shop, zoning shop, economic, and they ask us, hey, I've got this land, or I want to consolidate this land, and I want to do this and that and the other thing. The stumbling blocks that they run into, number one is, so there are a couple of these, so these aren't in any particular order. I said number one, but I should have just said the point. One is the cost of parking. Surface parking is relatively inexpensive, right? It's $5,000 to $10,000 a space. But then, depending on how much activity you've got in the building, and you're trying to find a way to park your project, suddenly you're looking at structured parking, and then there's just not enough building to make it work. It's very inefficient to develop parking on a small lot because you can't get double loaded drive aisles, and it just doesn't work out. So sometimes for a larger project, they're curtailed just by how much parking you can fit on there. And we've actually seen that's actually what's stalling a lot of the existing commercial uses, where people have successful businesses in there and they want to expand, and they can't figure out how to meet the parking requirements for a larger building. So cost of parking is one, and the amount of required parking. And then the other is the land prices. So when people think about, well, I want to buy a property, I'm a small business owner, I want to have some space for myself, maybe some expansion space that I'll lease out for now, but in order to be able to buy the land and finance it, I need to be able to put residential in there. And that's certainly what the Tradition Homes proposal was about. It was going to be their professional office space, their permanent home here in the city, and then to finance the project, they were going to cover it with the residential. And so I think proposals are including a significant amount of residential, which often drives up the height, but they need that height because of the land prices. So I think something that also might happen here, and I think this would be beneficial, is maybe to reset the land prices. Because I think when developers look at the city, you've got by right and you've got the SE process. And if there's nothing in between those, then they assume that their comparable prices, certainly the landowners are thinking their comparable prices are the SE projects. And that's what drives the projects to be as tall as they are.
But fundamentally, those two projects were attempted under the existing special exception approach and the traditional kind of rezoning. Whereas my sense of what council is trying to do here is to see if we could take these T-zones and that area of the zoning code and see if we can tweak it in such a way as to allow more development, especially development that increasingly came to their attention, which is housing, and allow for that to occur under the T-zone
With a
umbrella.
special use permit.
With a special use permit, that's right.
Yeah, I think what we've seen over time is through the SE process, typically if you sort of look at a trend line in sort of projects' heights and bulks and acreages, that over time, as land prices have gone up, those projects have gotten larger. And so that was council's original direction to staff, was can you find an all-residential option that would promote some of these smaller acreage projects. And so that's why we did drop the height down from what you can otherwise get in an SE. That's why we did draw the lot coverage back from what you can get in otherwise in an SE. So that was the purpose here, was to try and drive out a smaller acreage project.
Paul, for everyone's benefit, could you just review how you guys envisioned this special permit process working on this? Because it's just so everyone remembers what that is.
Sure, and the special use permit process exists in the zoning ordinance today, but it's not something that people are usually familiar with. I think today the things that would go through there are daycare uses in an R district. So there was a recent application to actually continue a daycare that's been operating in the Scout House for some time. That had to go through an SUP. There's a whole lot of code related to how drive-throughs are regulated. That's done through the SUP. And then something that hasn't been used in decades, but if you want to do a taller building in a residential multi-family district, there are provisions for a special use permit. But a special use permit is something that's enabled under Virginia zoning code, and it understands that it is not something that is strictly by right, So it's understood to be a use or a bulk that may put additional strain on neighbors or the neighborhood. And so as part of a special use process, the approving body, in this case it would be council, can attach particular conditions to it. So whether that's, where the drive aisles are located, or what their loading hours can be, or how the lights can shine at different hours of the day, it's all those conditions are related to mitigating any impact on the neighbors or the neighborhood. Beyond what would otherwise be an impact from a by right development. So it's acknowledging that all development has some impact, but special use permits should not exceed what can be done by right. So what's up on the screen here, this is in the staff report. What's in the column on the, obviously the far left column is a tally of months. Middle column is the special exception process. Far right column is potentially what a special use permit could look like for a T-zone application. As with any application, it begins with a staff review through all of the disciplines. Planning, building safety, housing, engineering, including transportation as well as stormwater, city arborist, all those different specialties would look at it for consistency with local codes, state codes, federal codes. And then that would go to a first council work session approximately 1 month after the submittal. And then it would also go out in the case of an SE. The Planning Commission has been hosting preliminary workshops with all boards and commissions. And then it's just a little different here for an SUP because it was council's direction to allow this for a smaller project, so they thought there would be fewer impacts. Send it out to the Planning Commission and the AAB for a preliminary workshop. And then we would proceed. Typically, SEs include a public walking tour. We've been on a few of those for Founders 2, the Broad and Washington proposal, the One City Center proposal. Going into month 3, applicant would be expected to come in with a second resubmittal responding to everything they've heard so far from staff, council, boards and commissions, public. Another month of review, again by all the disciplines, go to a second council work session. And this is where the two processes start to diverge. So I'll just stick with the one on the far right for simplicity here. So the expectation is that, assuming that the responses from the applicant were acceptable to council, perhaps with some additional guidance, council would grant a first reading and a referral, which would go out specifically to the Planning Commission as well as the AEB. Those groups would hold work sessions. Now we're into month 6. If we go to the next page, Planning Commission and AAB would be expected to make their recommendations back to council in that time frame, and that would likely include some slip sheets, some modifications from the applicant in response to those groups, a clean submittal of all the changes made in response to boards and commissions, another council work session, and of course the Planning Commission action as well as the council actions would all be subjects of public hearing, and of course all these things would be noticed on our city website, and then it would be final council consideration by approximately month 8. Now that, and I will say that's the fastest, for the SE process where we charted that out, we presume sort of an 11-month process for special exceptions. But with recent projects, what's been sort of more typical is sort of 1.5 to 2 years. So what's here is sort of the fastest the wheels of the review process can spin. But obviously, depending on the quality of the comments or the depth of the comments, that process often takes longer.
So the question I have is how much discretion will council have on these special use permit requests? For example, to Brent's point early on about differentiating between Park Street and North Washington.
Sure, there.
Council be able to take a look at a project that is proposed for Park Avenue and say, well, we agree with Mr. Krasner that it really should be more of a residential nature here, and this particular project has some commercial in there, which we don't think is right, so we're not going to allow this special use permit. Is that an example of discretion that they would have?
Yeah, so no decision by a public body is supposed to be arbitrary and capricious, right? The idea is that you don't submit a permit one day and someone's, gosh, I really just don't like the font you used here. I just can't approve this project. So obviously there's supposed to be conditions and standards. Mr. Trainer, if you can go to line 662.
By the way, I would never accuse council of being arbitrary
Basing it on
and capricious.
font. No, I don't think they've ever done that. But obviously, these are the considerations, and I think we probably missed one here. Obviously, consistency with the comp plan should probably be number one. But there are conditions that council would consider in considering any application for a special use permit, and you would spell those out here. And obviously, there's some.
Right. I mean, the point is, like, if the ordinance allows it, people are going to want to do it. So, I mean, it's better to avoid that, by not wasting anyone's time,
Right.
by making it clear in the ordinance, clear in the comp plan and in the ordinance,
Right.
what you want to see,
Yeah.
and that way you get applications that come in that attempt to provide that, if they're feasible. I mean, people would. So you wouldn't want to, I think, allow if you're sure you don't want a certain type of use in a certain spot, then you shouldn't. And we're looking at it today, we shouldn't allow it.
And I should clarify also, so, and again, because this is an SUP, council could attach conditions to that approval. And then the other thing I should point out is this is only one part of the entitlement process. So this is your zoning entitlement, but it's not actually a permission to build anything yet. You would still need a site plan, and that's where the site engineering would be conducted, as stormwater, traffic analysis, lighting impacts, things of that nature. And then, of course, you still need a building permit to make sure it's going to be a safe structure. So this piece here is really related to the zoning and the use and the general shape of the building, and then it would be the site plan where the detailed engineering would get worked out.
The other thing to highlight, if I understand correctly, is that the special use permit process allows for public input.
Yes, it does. As I said, there are multiple public hearings built into that process,
Right.
and as well as noticing requirement. So obviously the intention is, right, none of this is supposed to be secret. And so that's one of the reasons why staff suggested the SUP process. The other reason for suggesting the SUP process, I'm jumping topics a little bit, but because it is a conditional use, that's why you can attach additional conditions, whether that's affordable housing or other things that are listed as sort of requirements.
And this is not new, it's just not a commonly used process.
Correct. Yeah, it's not commonly used in the sense that they sort of occur, but there's some of them are approved by the BZA, some are approved by the council. Most of the SUPs that are applied for today, like daycares in a residential district, go before the BZA. Certainly those are advertised, but they don't draw a lot of attention.
Yes.
We saw that. Yeah, that came to us too. Well, because that was a BZA.
We made a recommendation.
We review BZA actions and make a recommendation to them, right? So
Right.
sounds like we saw that. Yeah.
So the things, the uses that would go under a special use permit is anything residential. Is that correct? So
Yes,
long
that's how
as it
it's
is
proposed.
under 1 acre.
Yes.
Okay, and if it's over 1 acre, then
Then no residential would be, under this code amendment, no residential will be allowed for projects over an acre. The motivation for that when it was drafted was that really this was supposed to be against sort of smaller acreage projects. And so if you are getting into the bigger acreage project, then the thought in drafting this was that then the SE process is the right venue because there are boards and commissions involved. And although both processes include public engagement, SE obviously includes more.
so if a developer's interested in a 1.1 acre mixed-use development, then they would apply for an application for rezoning along with this. I guess my next question is, do we want more housing? Do we want that? Do we want to require that special use permit? That meets those limitations. This is where I'm balancing against what's in the small area plans, which say we want a mix of commercial and residential and housing plan, and then the conversation we just had, we need to bring on like an additional 2,000-ish households over the next decade, right? So do we want to slow roll houses, or is there stuff there? Is there, is that what we want, special use? Like, you could have large-ish, all commercial by right, that's permissible. That might not be likely, but it might also not be what we want in the comp plan, but it could be permissible. And what's permissible now, if we don't come back and update this ordinance for another 15 years or whatever, then do market conditions change? Are we just relying on market conditions to prevent something we don't want? And are we making it too
Yeah.
hard to get what we do want?
Well, planning's always a moving target. I mean, I agree. We can't always anticipate. You do your best to be realistic. I mean, certainly there are many examples of zoning ordinances and comp plan recommendations that turned out to not be realistic and were never able to be achieved. And so, I mean, ideally, we'd like to not do that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think housing certainly is I think we've all identified that there's a housing shortage. Housing shortage in the region is a housing shortage in Falls Church, based on both type and based on affordability. And so there certainly is a market for that. I mean, and our comp plan already speaks to that in other areas. So, I mean, in that sense, I think it's, there's a lot of support for that, and it's realistic, and it's, so but that's always been my problem with this is that, there's been different terms tossed around, as far as missing income, missing housing type, missing what middle is missing. I've heard many different, thoughts on that. So, and you can't solve all those issues with the limited area in the T-zones, but, but I do think we do have to be careful about, it's been planned for mixed use, and that's not, as Paul highlighted, there are certain issues, reasons why that's not going to happen, at least on Park, most likely. So if we're looking at changing it, I mean, I think ideally we don't want to waste, go through this exercise and have nothing to show for it. So ideally we would pick something that seems, at least based on the best information we have today, you can't predict out 20 years in the future that well, but, in the next 3 to 5 years, what seems reasonable that this might spur some activity that we do want to see in those areas.
I think we see a lot of focus on commercial in our current plans because going back to the 1980s, 1990s, that's kind of what the city wanted. Kind of viewed residential as carrying along costs that
Right.
increased taxes. And the way you solve that is kind of looking to what Arlington did with their very successful commercial development program. That's what the focus of the city was. The problem that I have with that today is that, just about everything I read, is that commercial retail has been overbuilt in the country, and if we try to force a lot of that here in areas where doesn't have good exposure, foot traffic, and so forth, that we risk having a lot of empty storefronts. So that's one of several reasons why I'd kind of like to see as much residential development occur as possible. I think where you were going with this is, do we need to go back and tell council, if this is what we want? Yeah, well, you've got to come up with the rules that very clearly, incent that type of. I don't know. I mean, it's a valid point to discuss. Any other?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I want to talk about because the disallowing of any residential by right just doesn't sit well with me. And I do think it's appropriate for larger buildings to go through some sort of special use permit, but I would say that should apply to commercial buildings too, which I think is the point that you're making, Corey, because if you're talking about a really large project, it is going to impact the neighbors, then I think, council should be able to have some oversight of that. But I do think smaller residential projects, things like triplexes or quads, like, something that's more like a little bigger than house scale, but not as big as like a small condo building, could be built by right, potentially. I would support that because I don't think it's right to remove any
Well,
potential.
something has to be by right, like just legally speaking. They got to have at least some baseline that someone
There is no residential.
that a property owner can do. Well, it's got some use, whatever it is. You can't literally
Well,
make.
there's lots of by right, yeah, and including
Yeah.
parking lots too, which actually is maybe
that
one.
list that's in there now is quite right. Whether somebody would accuse you of a taking if you just rely on that and don't have some housing in there, I don't know. That goes beyond my knowledge. But yeah, I tend to agree with that. I mean, if you come up with something that, especially if it's no bigger than, let's say, a McMansion in our residential zones, like a triplex or something like that, or a quad. If you can fit it so that it looks like a house and it fits in the neighborhood, that strikes me as a good candidate. for buy rate. Now, that's not to say there won't be issues there. I'm sure a lot of people will be very concerned about, well, gee, if you have 4 units in that building, what about all the cars? Where are you going to put them? You know, they're going to spill over. You know, you're going to have those issues. Stormwater, all of those things will continue to be there. But if you are going to have a housing buy right, that strikes me, if you pick something that's no worse than what we already allow in our residential.
Right, well, right now, you can have single-family in T-zones, right? So,
With 4 cars, I'll just
yeah.
say.
You got
Put that out.
Single-family detached, right? Just
Not unusual.
Yeah, so, but I agree with you. That's probably the direction I would like to see. That some smaller, multifamily, whether it's a quad or whatever, something like that.
Right.
Up to that level could happen by right.
Because then I think you're encouraging those smaller residential projects.
Right.
And the larger residential projects, which I would also support, would go through an appropriate special use permit process. I think the trick is, like, how do you keep those smaller projects more affordable so they're not just
Yeah.
luxury, and they are providing that diversity of housing types and price points. Maybe you do that with a quad, I don't know.
Well, yeah, it's really, the affordable housing issue is a tough one, but it strikes me if you've got something that's the same size as a McMansion, and you're putting in 4 units in that, if you think you can get the same price for each of those 4 as, the single large house, I just don't think that's going to happen.
Unless you've got really nice finishes.
So you are getting a lower price for a smaller amount of space. I mean, that's
Right.
Basically.
That would be the expectation.
Yeah. Not by no means satisfies affordable housing. I'm not trying to say.
No,
that.
it doesn't, but it fits, yeah.
I think that's the principle, being clear about what we actually want.
Right.
Right, I see what you mean. There's a lack of clarity that's in the plan now because we haven't really had that one.
Some of the things are bank shots rather than explicit. I think that's a good point.
I think we just hit on something pretty, I don't know, that feels pretty clear to me, right? As a proposal and a recommendation.
Mhm.
We know we need more housing. We know that in Park Avenue in particular, it's like more residential. So he's talked about the M zone, yes, it's more residential. So we allow by right smaller scale residential that fits in the neighborhood and fits larger, and let's go through the review. And then we should probably think about North Washington too, and what is there, because it's different.
Well, can you talk about the staff recommendation that was added, or Jack, sorry, to the staff report for the properties north of Great Falls?
Residential uses north of Great Falls,
Yeah.
North Washington.
Because I think that might be related to your question, Corey.
I think it's here earlier too about the different treating.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that gets into the kind of larger parcel sizes right above Great Falls Street on North Washington, versus like further down, and those are a little harder to see. You have kind of smaller parcels that might be closer to that 1 acre in size. So encouraging kind of different developments north of Great Falls Street, which is called out in the downtown small area plan too, is as that kind of boundary.
You're saying that all of those would just have to come in as rezoning requests?
Under the current proposal, yeah. I mean, with the 1 acre threshold. I mean, these are all kind of
But
larger.
you said north of Great Falls, so you're saying everything.
Yeah, north of Great Falls.
Yeah, so if you had something, let's say, less than an acre.
Yeah,
and-
Like the 400 North Washington property, that's
Right.
less than an acre.
this one. Yeah.
You're saying no residential uses, that's what I'm trying to square that.
If I could, it's in the staff report. There's an analysis of the because the T zones do exist throughout the community, and then the small area plans do provide some additional guidance on the development of those individual T zones. Tabs. Line 171 of the staff report. It provides guidance out of the North Washington Street Small Area Plan. And the vision there in the North Washington Street Small Area Plan was to sort of imagine that North Washington Street is something of a retail corridor where you do have some larger parcels under consolidated ownership. And so the thought was these T-zones, again, are really steered toward these sort of 1 acre or smaller residential projects. And if there is the opportunity where you are along a commercial corridor to pursue a larger redevelopment, then the SE process is a better venue for that.
So you're saying preference is not to have residential that comes in through the SUP process, that you can have residential there, but you'd have to come in through the special exception process?
Right, certainly, right. The existing zoning is sort of consistent with the small area plan in that it allows for commercial development along the corridor. And then if someone wanted to come in with residential in addition to the commercial, then the right avenue for that is at least as the city's got it worked out today, is the SE process and a rezoning.
How would that be worded in a recommendation that we make back to council?
Yeah, we did put words on paper. I don't know that
Used
they
a
were
few of
great.
us.
Yeah, I don't think they were great, and that's obvious, from the feedback we got at this work session. So I think we would look to reword that again. But I think the important thing tonight is to get a sense of, is that the right direction? Does the commission want staff to fix that wording?
Well, at a conceptual level, I see the point that projects along that area are probably going to be big enough that you want the special exception and the full council discussion process to take place. At the same time, if I look down the road 10 years at that area, especially after the $22 million grant that the city is going to get to redo to make the whole North Washington area more walkable, et cetera, and hopefully a western entrance to the East Falls Church Metro Station, I could see that area really becoming a magnet for people wanting to possibly just get along without a car and just, kind of live in that area and have an urban feel to it. So that's the only caution that I have is not to get too headlong into no residential that we don't.
So one thing, sort of a reference point, sort of talking about sort of market factors. Back when we were, and you can see it in the Wilmata development around the metro station, that if you ask the development community what they want to build townhouses. And so if you, because that's the biggest return in terms of construction costs and sales points. So if you allow someone a path to go through one process that results in townhouses and one process that results in mixed-use development with committed commercial, they're going to pick the townhouse avenue. And so I think if the small area plan vision is to support sort of a commercial corridor there, then I think you'd want to be careful about providing sort of an all townhouse option, because I think that would be the most attractive one.
What's going on? I'm just looking at that area in the future land use map, right? Like there's some medium density residential. I think the historic properties. There's some historic properties over there too. Like if we say anything north of Great Falls,
There's a couple older, there are a couple, yeah.
right? I mean, I just like the part that's to the west.
And the map is misleading because some of those property, that's like, included in the T zone, right? It's like the Sunrise is in T. I mean, some of the larger chunks there are probably not going to change.
Columbia Baptist.
Crossman Church. I mean, there's a few properties there that are probably not going anywhere for a very.
City's group home.
I mean, again, like we could probably look, and there are a few candidates, maybe more on the other side of the street that people could actually consolidate and do something. Some of the auto repair places, there's a couple older office buildings, but yeah, you start getting into like I don't know. That's the thing. It's such a small area we're dealing with here. We can almost plan it site by site. It's kind of what they do in Fairfax. They kind of plans things site by site. But not saying we should do that. But it's so it's difficult because you're dealing with there are so many issues. I mean, I think Ms. Teets, no longer on the commission, but she raised the issue several times about the several historic properties there that we'd have to think carefully about what if someone came in with a proposal for those. I mean so yeah, it's difficult because the character is so kind of diverse from lot to lot there. You have some office condominium buildings that are They're not going anywhere because they're owned by many different, entities because they're office condos, and then you have, so it's just it's hard. It's hard to come up with like a discrete set of rules that are going to work for all those scenarios.
That might be a good transition to the other new recommendation in the staff, in the motion about the historic. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure.
I think we didn't quite understand how that would work.
Yeah, and I brought I had the code up. So this references the HCC. Whoops. Yeah, this mouse is kind of finicky. Where the HCC specifically calls out protections for designated properties in R1A and B. It doesn't mention T specifically, but I think the recommendation would be, chewing on what, an amendment to this section might look like to include T properties. And the reason we it might be inadvisable to just include T into the existing code is because there are minimum lot size requirements that any subdivision of a designated property would require the minimum lot size of R1A, which is maybe, I think it's like 11,000 square feet, and would not necessarily encourage a property's preservation, but instead demolition, because you couldn't subdivide it, just the structure, and build around it essentially. So I think that's why that's in there, is to recommend some language to. I'm sorry, I'm talking as I'm looking for the.
So more to allow some flexibility in the lot size in order to encourage the preservation.
To encourage preservation and perhaps
of the building.
subdivision.
So what incentive do we have for people to utilize that? I mean, because it would be easier for them to just tear down a historic building and build a larger structure, right? Is there some sort of incentive that we can offer?
The time's an incentive. So under the HCC, if you do make an application to tear down, to raise a designated structure, you do have to make an application to the Historic Architecture Review Board, and if they deny the application, there's the most likely waiting period for all properties is going to be a minimum 1 year waiting period, where you have to wait to see if a buyer wants to take the property on at a fair market value. So that 1 year waiting period can be costly. And so I think part of the incentive here is that if you can come in with a proposal to reuse the land, hold on to the historic structure, and find a way to incorporate it into the site design, then you can proceed with development. But if you're really set on tearing down that structure, then you're going to walk into that 1 year waiting period, and that's going to be pricey. Because even after you get through that 1 year waiting period, you're then starting your entitlement process. And so I think that's a disincentive to tear down. So it's a disincentive to tear down, which means it's an incentive to incorporate the structure. And we've been trading some messages, and we have now a deeper conversation scheduled with the chair of the Historical Commission, Ron Anzalone. And it was actually their comments that had motivated us to explore this deeper and try to figure out a way to hold on to these structures.
Okay, so just to be clear, historic structures in T-zones are protected?
They don't have the same protections that they would if they were in an R1A or R1B. So we actually did write our recommendation a little quickly. So in a T-zone today, you can actually, so it's sort of a strange thing. If you've got a historic structure on an R1A or R1B lot, then you cannot reduce the lot size below 11,250. That same protection does not exist in T, so you could actually reduce the lot size below 11,250 if it was zone T. But I think what we would want to do is add some language into the talking about sort of the considerations for these conditional uses. I think you would want to add a consideration that the historic structure is preserved, with an appropriate setting and incorporated into the development.
Anything else on historic? I was going to suggest a segue to that, which also kind of falls under protected, is our existing single-family homes, and the wording that you have in the staff report. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit. I'm not sure I fully understand how that would work with the 6 months and so forth. Give that a go.
But the CO,
Existing single-family houses,
If the use is discontinued for 6 months, then they could not continue as single-family uses. Is that right? Or something like that.
yeah, I mean, just want to know what is the impact on people that are in existing single-family homes. Their ability to expand their building, if their house burned down, could they rebuild it? Just stuff like that.
Yeah, so this was I think a good comment that came in about you don't want to put people in a bad situation where they developed a single-family house in good faith and then they're sort of stuck because the zoning code changes underneath them. We see that with non-conforming corner properties. We see it in Greenway Downs a lot where people have to come in for variances just to put a second story on an existing structure. So zoning can actually be a sort of a disincentive to housing preservation. And so that's why we added this in here, the idea of if you've right, because certainly there are a lot of, I'll say single-family structures. Some of them are businesses, some of them are houses, especially along Park Avenue, but along other corridors in the city. So so under this provision, if someone has a single-family house and they're using it as a single-family house, with this provision, they could keep doing that so long as they keep using it as a single-family house. The reason for the 6 months is that's sort of a common time frame for considering a use to have been abandoned. So if you have a use that's otherwise not allowed,
6 months.
so long as you keep using it, that's fine. But once you go past that 6 month mark, you're considered to have abandoned it.
Just kinda short.
And so,
Even if they're paying taxes?
well, that would still be continuing the use. So it's not. Go ahead.
So, say I'm in this T-zone.
Yep.
I have a by right, I can go commercial up to 4 stories. 3 stories? 4 stories.
Today, 3 stories.
So, but right now I have a single family house that's decrepit and I want to develop it. So I can sit on it for 6 months, have nobody living in it. I can pave it over and get my parking lot. So I have all impervious lot. Then I can develop a by right commercial building that's 3 stories with 0 setback on neighboring properties and not have to worry about my stormwater because I've paved over what's there. And so now I can just go with what's existing. Is that possible under this?
No. So a couple things would trigger here. They're sort of different avenues there. So so this isn't really related to sort of a path for redevelopment in the sense that if you had a single family house today and you wanted to redevelop it, you could do that now. You don't have to wait 6 months before you do that. You can change the use of your property to anything else that's by right. So it's not really it's not a permission to change use. It's a permission to keep using the single family house. As far as the paving the lot, any land disturbance on that scale would trigger, at a minimum, a grading plan requirement, if not also a site plan requirement.
Over 2,500 square feet, right? So
Yeah, and so so you would trigger a stormwater review. And under the existing code, you can't do anything with your land that increases your stormwater runoff. And that's so whether you're building by right or not, you can't develop in a way that increases your stormwater runoff, and that's going to be reviewed anytime somebody does something with their land on that scale. Right, if someone puts down a few brick pavers for a patio, that doesn't get checked because it's under the square footage requirement, but certainly something as large as you're sort of asking paving an entire lot would certainly trigger it. We've seen some of that creep in single family, where people do sort of portion small pieces of patio on over time, and no individual addition to that residential patio triggers it. In the commercial corridors, we generally keep a better eye on that because the provisions are a little different. Single family is actually exempted from site plan review. So when things change, when conditions change on a commercial property, we hold them accountable to the site plan approval, which is either done by planning commission or planning director. And we can hold them to what's on the paper, and so we know that the engineering still holds. In residential, they're exempted from that, and so it's different.
So this would be a way to protect, sorry, just to go back to the see this new recommendation. It would be a way to protect existing single-family homeowners who their use is going to be discontinued under the proposed.
Correct. They could continue to
Yeah.
use it, and they could continue to sort of modify the home and expand on it to within sort of the allowable construction limits.
And if their house burns down.
They could rebuild it.
Okay.
And none of this affects the existing townhouse communities there along Park. Because
Correct.
those are under a different zoning.
Yes. Yeah, and some of those are also subject to another. Yeah.
Recommend that the discontinued for 6 consecutive months. You have to clarify what discontinued means. Does it mean you're saying not paying their taxes, right? And so,
Is that like a planning term that is
Yeah,
widely
I've never
understood?
heard discontinued. I've never heard that.
Well, I mean,
Yep.
that's not a unique term. I mean, 6 months is actually kind of short, but what the use is. Actually, there's some stuff, we gotta check Virginia code, you know, there's some stuff in Virginia code about, like, non-conforming uses and when they're allowed to be, you know, that is a zoning technique to, you have non-conforming uses, and if they go away for a certain period of time, then they lose whatever protection they had as a legal non-conforming use. So there's a lot of case law and history about non-conforming uses and how to
I assume it was kind of similar to the
Zone
situation
out.
we have with Greenway Downs.
Yeah, Greenway Downs is a little different because there's no specific protection for those houses. So for folks who don't know, Greenway Downs subdivided before the city had a zoning ordinance, and most of the lots, I think, have 50 feet a lot width. R1B requires, I think, 60 or 75 feet a lot width. And then the houses all have 20-foot setbacks, and R1B requires 25-foot setbacks. And so and they also don't meet the side yard setback requirements. And so what we see when someone wants to put a second story on their Rambler, they have sort of two options. They can tear the thing down and push the house back 5 feet, or they can come in for a variance. Often those variances are granted, although there's a question about whether variances should be granted on such a routine nature. The Planning Commission in the past has suggested providing an overlay so that people don't have to go through that process. If this is, I think generally preserving a house is the sort of the greenest building you have is the one you've already got. There's a lot of what's called embedded carbon, the sort of carbon cost of getting materials on site, removing the materials from the site. So finding a way to keep those houses and allowing people to sort of stay in place and expand as they need is certainly a more sustainable option. So it's a little different. It's a little bit different, a little bit the same. That you've got something that's generally working, and you want to find a way to protect it.
Since we're on this page, do you want to talk about parking? I know you had questions about parking, Rob. So there was a recommendation there.
Yeah, I'm curious about the changes here and how you calculate off-street parking availability. In some ways, off-street parking availability. What's the gist?
Sure. To clarify, is the question how is off-street parking calculated?
Just in general,
Or-
just what's the genesis of the change? What was it before?
I think it was 2.5 off-street parking spaces per dwelling unit. I think so. The recommendation here is to put the minimum down to 1, as part of an environmental measure.
Same as single-family housing.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think state code, I don't know, I think it says you have to give people 2 years. You can't limit it to 6 months, I think.
You may have to be more
I'm
lenient.
Googling it as we're in real time here, but I think it's 2 years is Virginia code on that point.
We should match the code. We shouldn't do worse
I
than the code.
don't think we're
That's-
allowed. I don't think we're allowed to do
Correct.
less than the code.
We are not empowered
Unless I'm
to do that.
missing. Sometimes there's weird Easter eggs in the
It does
code,
touch on
Virginia law, but
another issue, and that's at some point this will have to go through legal review. I don't know that it has so far.
We've had hallway chats with the city attorney to make sure that we're not sort of off base with what we're saying and making sure our recommendations are consistent with enabling legislation. But obviously, once you all sort of formalize your recommendation back, obviously that would get scrubbed.
Just as far as parking, if this was eliminated completely, I would be supportive of that. There is off-street parking as well in that area, especially on Park. So, again, to your point earlier, if parking regulations in the city is a deterrent for the land to be developed, then I mean,
So just to clarify, the intent behind this provision is actually to reduce the amount of required parking?
for one,
Correct. And you're suggesting reduce it to 0?
In other words, let the developer decide if they want to put parking there.
it's not fine.
That may be a part too far, but.
I think
Not
that
that I
the
disagree
the
with it.
newer like mixed use buildings that have been built lately, I think the ratio that we're seeing there is 0.9 spaces per unit is what, and they're parked at much higher than that. I'm not sure exactly what they're parked at, but they're not, the parking is not filling in those buildings. So I think looking at that guidance, and those are much larger projects, much larger buildings, way more residents, but I think people do tend to have one car. I think you could have a building where you have people, and I know people in the city who don't own vehicles, but they're kind of a rare breed at this point. So I would be comfortable with the requirement for one, though. When we look at our minimum parking requirements in the future, I think that would be, it's a bigger picture discussion that I think we need to have. But I don't know that that's something we should solve for here.
The council has said that they want to look at comprehensive parking.
Yes. Yeah.
Could you talk about the one, or the I item, the maximum of one curb cut per street frontage? That's per project, I assume?
Yeah, yeah, right, per project, facing, every street would be one curb cut to, incentivize parking in the rear and like off street instead of in front.
It also helps to protect pedestrians, right? Because you have fewer curb cuts and fewer conflicts with cars. So when people are walking down the street, it's safer.
You can
Street frontage, like in a townhouse community example.
So I don't in any way mean to throw at. I'll pick a non-city project. That's what I'm going to do. So you can see. Oh gosh, I'm not going to be able to find it quickly though. But you can see sort of townhouse projects throughout the region where the way the townhouses met the parking requirement was to do one garage sort of space on the ground floor, and then they tandem parked one space in the driveway in front of it, and so then every 16 to 20 foot wide townhouse has a driveway coming out onto the street. And so, yes, you've met the parking code, but now you've made a pretty bad condition for pedestrians, and you've actually removed all the parking that used to be along the street. So you've essentially taken the public street parking and privatized it for the folks adjoining. And so the vision here is that you would pull the townhouses closer to the street, and that you would still require, at least under this recommendation, you'd still require the space, but the way you would access it is by some common drive aisle off the side of the project or from the back of the project. Per project development. So if you built a bank of 4, 6, 8 townhouses, you would have one curb cut that would sort of L around the site.
To feed the project, yeah.
And if that project was a corner project,
Think
could
about-
it have
Yeah, there's in terms of design, you can actually see that on the townhouse projects on Park Avenue today. If you think about, there's the one townhouse project on the south side of Park where there's sort of a central walking sort of muse, and then there are drive aisles on either side. Now they actually have 2, but the idea is that all the parking is sort of side loaded to the units, and so that you end up with only 2 curb cuts on the street. And then the townhouses on the north side, again, they share one curb cut to access Park Avenue, and then they access the garages off of the drive aisle.
Is it in our urban design guidelines by any chance? Do you know?
There is guidance to reduce the number of curb cuts. The design guidance isn't and I think you would probably want to have some sort of waiver provision for a that would sort of go to the planning commission here to consider a special circumstance where they might need for some strange, right? Maybe they want to preserve a tree, and the only way to do that is to get a second drive island or something like that.
I guess these sort of things are things that we could recommend, but we don't have to solve every.
Correct.
At this point.
I have one other thing on parking. So parking right now is a by right primary use, and I think it should not be a by right primary use. So I would like to recommend that we remove parking as a by right use. I don't think we have a lot in a T zone that it should just be a parking lot. I think parking can be incidental to the property, but it shouldn't be. And I mean, I guess if we want to grandfather that in explicitly, that's fine. But I don't think people should be buying these lots and building a
I don't
parking
think we have
lot.
any principally, any like paid, like parking lots, right? We don't have anything like that, right? Along that,
Right. I think all the parking lots are accessory
we
to.
don't have any principal
Okay.
parking lots.
But
Yeah.
we could. I guess somebody could build one. I don't know why they would, but we might as well just take, I mean, it can be, yeah, just remove it as a principal use.
I would support that.
Think about the other current by right use, because the only thing that was taken off was boarding houses.
Yes, can you talk about that, the definition of the clinics for human care? Can you explain what that is?
So that's one I need to do a little more research on, and I can do that. I can reach out to the zoning administrator and get a advice from her about sort of what is included in that list and what's not. That's we've had a bit of staffing turnover, and I know that's one that our previous expert on this, Susan Bell, had recommended incorporating. And so I'd want to, in either case, I should get some advice from the zoning administrator about what's included in that grouping.
When I looked at the zoning for the B1 district, I saw two separate uses listed. One was institutions for human care, and the other was clinics, among many other permitted uses. So I wondered if this was an attempt to kind of combine those two things, though they do sound different.
Also, a residential institution. Clear on what that is.
That's permitted today, right?
Our ordinance has so many like anachronistic terms, like residential
Not
institution.
like
I don't know what that is.
what's the
That may be something like a sunrise. I can
Sunrise.
double check what's meant there.
okay.
Right now, we'd call that assisted living or independent living.
That would be clearer.
Inns, beds, breakfasts. I don't know. I mean, I guess we're looking at this. What call the current by right uses?
I mean, if someone wanted to have a bed and breakfast here in Falls Church, I think on the T zones, I think we'd be okay with it. Right? I don't know.
So we can turn our house into a living
Whole another can of worms.
I think people are already doing that, right?
That's a completely different can of worms. I don't know if we want to tackle that.
Don't want to. Another topic we want
We haven't talked about scale yet, have we? That's kind
to
of.
start it, but then.
in the context of what? Yeah. So,
Well, can we just talk about scale and without getting into the uses and just the form of the building and the lot coverage and setbacks?
Sure. Do you have a recommendation? I mean,
So,
go
yeah,
ahead.
no, go ahead. No, you, Brent.
Well, I mean, as part of, my whole theme, I mean, I think on park, I mean, I know we've come, I think it, we're talking about allowing townhouses or stacked townhouses or quads. I mean, I think we probably need to go down to something like a 40-foot height as opposed to right now, I think the proposal was like 50.
It's 45 today
Yeah.
for the other uses, but yes, it's 50 in four
Right,
stories.
so 50 I think is too tall, and so, I was thinking more like, 40, which is more like a townhouse, typical townhouse height, but.
Well, at street level,
um,
this has 3 stories, right?
Yes, and 40 at the street. It's a 10-foot step back and step up.
Right.
Is
So
that
this is
right?
lower than council's, or what we're talking about is lower than.
Right.
council.
Right, at least along that stretch. I mean, I think along North Washington, it's different. But and as far as the lot coverage, I mean, it's hard, without, again, it's called be arbitrary. I mean, it's hard to identify what the right lot coverage is. I mean, I know 80 I think it seemed too high. Wasn't leaving enough of the lot, as open space. But 60 could be a little low, also for for townhouses. I mean, also, for townhouses, a lot of times this is not going to be a big townhouse community, right? We're talking about smaller areas here, and so if they have their own kind of privacy yard in the back, I mean, sometimes it's okay if they have more lot coverage in general, if they have a little bit of outdoor privacy space, like 150 or 200 square feet of like a privacy yard, and so it's hard to say that 60 is right there. I don't know. Without looking at like a site, maybe 70 is okay. If they're providing a privacy yard. So I don't know.
The problem that I saw was when you get up to like the 80 or maybe even 75, it starts to force the setbacks to be so small. So if you want to maintain some setbacks, then
Well, right, there's different ways to control bulk. You can control it with setbacks, with height, with open space. I mean, there's a few different ways to get at the same end result, in an ordinance, and you don't always need all of them at the same time because it may be counterproductive. But the question is, what are we most concerned about? Are we most concerned about height? Are we most concerned about separation from adjacent uses? I mean, that's I think that's something that we need to decide as far as what we're what are we trying to, what's the end result we're trying to provide.
I think getting the height right at the street is definitely important to create that kind of urban, the right feel. And I agree with you that, North Washington might have different requirements in that regard than Park Avenue might. But so, yeah, whether, 40 feet, I might ask our new member, Sharon, to help us a little bit with this conversation. I know there's this idea of creating this sense of enclosure for pedestrians. So buildings actually can create like a nice walkable environment. But if you make them too tall, then they could be, especially if there's no sort of like interaction between the building and the street. If you have doorways that people are coming in and out of and porches and things like that where there's human life and activity happening, that's one kind of building. If you have kind of a large, a building that doesn't have that, it can just feel like a big blank wall. So I think a lot of it kind of depends on the use too. But, I guess I think the idea or the way I read this was like, so we're at 45 feet today and 3 stories. And the idea of going to 50 feet and 4 stories, I sort of interpreted that as, well, we can have another story, we can have another level of apartments and fit more housing units, which we need. So that was sort of the way I interpreted that. I don't know if others did as well, or if that was the intention.
Yeah, the 3 stories, 45 feet has always been sort of an odd combination in the sense that with 45 feet, you can actually fit 4 stories of a building in there. So we have had a lot of applicants confused over that combination. So part of it was to write the number of stories with the number of feet, right? Obviously, that's an urban design approach, not necessarily an intensity approach. And then the reason for moving from 45 to 50 was that if somebody wanted to have maybe a grander sort of ceiling height within a townhouse, if they wanted an 11-foot ceiling and you still wanted to have 14 or 16 feet of ceiling height in the ground floor for some sort of commercial use or a taller lobby. The idea was that if you think about 10 feet for a floor, and then that remaining 10 feet could be divvied across those floors if they needed a little more ceiling height. It would also allow, if you had building height is calculated from average grade, so if you had sort of an odd slope, it might give you a little bit of play to fit a building without needing variance.
I don't want to call on you, but I just,
The only concern that I have with the height is that, is it possible that, it's supposed to be a transition, right, from our high volume commercial, but with this, isn't there going to be some instances where our transition is higher than what's in the location, and that's just going to look weird. That doesn't even make sense, right? So like we're gonna have some spaces where it's supposed to, the height's supposed to be here and then we transition down. In some spaces, it's gonna literally be the opposite.
Yeah, we have that already with Betos, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's-
I mean, I guess it's
that's
just
a problem.
until those properties redevelop, which eventually you would expect them to. I just don't know that those kinds of.
Yeah, I just think that, I'm speaking, I think for some people in the audience that we heard that are still here, when they testified, they're like, okay, well, we're in a building and there's supposed to be a transition down to less density. And the way it's written, in some spaces, there's gonna be a transition to more density.
More height, you mean?
Yeah, more height.
But most of the buildings on Broad will be higher. Most of the buildings are able to be built to 75. Is that the by right height? You might need to help me remember the numbers. And then
For
under special
B1,
exception, is it
yeah, for
55
B-
and 85?
Yeah, for B1 it's 55 and 85, and for B2 it's 5 and 110.
And most of what we're building now on Broad is the 85.
Plus or minus, they usually keep a couple feet just in case something happens.
Can you establish a code that says, look what's there, and then use that to determine how high you go? It seems hard to fathom.
Right.
I
No,
understand
I'm
your
not
point,
saying
but-
that, I'm
Yeah,
just
'cause
saying that,
Probably don't want to go there. Then we get into the trouble with our lot, like our lot averaging
you know.
stuff when, it's like a moment in time and then things change.
But, I mean, I'm glad that we went from coverage from 80 to 60. I mean, when we all looked at the visual of the 80, it just didn't fit with anything in the
It looked
town.
like a B-zone, mixed-use, large
Yeah,
mixed-use
so,
project.
I know we're kind of now saying, oh, could it be 70 but, and I think also, again, to get public support when it goes from 80 to 60, we're probably going to get more public support. If you took the stories from, 4 and made it 3, or brought it down a little bit, again, you could say, we heard you, community, and we still need to do economic development. That's what this is all about. But we are listening and we are trying our best to do a zoning change that stimulates the development, but listens to the public sentiment that doesn't want this. So, and it seems like we did that with the lot coverage, but we haven't done that with the height.
I think we also did it with the setback. The rear setback is now
Okay,
proposed
yeah,
to be
I know. So
20
we got one other
feet.
category. So it's
How
just,
about impervious coverage? Right now, there's no limit, right?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that too. And I know Sharon would.
Yeah, I would. But I kind of want to go back a little bit because I'm looking at where these T-zones are on Park Avenue. The proposed ones that are on the south side of Park, right? They're over on the back side of the spectrum, right? To the west of the spectrum, where I think that there's a couple of low houses right now.
Right.
And then there's that garage, that parking garage for the
Hilton. Yeah.
Hilton. And then back by, what is that, South Oak Street? I'm trying to visualize what's over there. Oak
Near
Street.
St. James. It's St. James.
St. James is
the
right
school,
there.
The
So-
church.
There's the
I
law
think-
office on the one side and the St. James on the
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was just trying to visualize what that lot was. And I mean, St. James could go, use that parking lot and develop that at some point and keep parking underground, right? If they ever wanted to. But I think the issue for me is for the 50 feet going across to the north side of the park. I'm not so concerned about the back side because of how everything's already developed there, right? Or has a by right to be at 80, 85,
55 with 85 under special exception.
right? But it's special exception, most of them
Yes.
have gone up. So, but my concern is, how does that step back away from the north side of Park so that as you're walking on Park, you don't feel this total lopsidedness
Balance.
of 50 feet to a regular 30-foot house, right? That's
Yeah, so two things on that. So on the north side, where you have the single-family zoning, the by right height is 35 feet to the midline of the roof. What we've seen with some of the larger square footage houses is actually the peak of the roof actually goes above 35 feet. what's included in what council referred out is actually a required step back. So if the T zone is adjacent, either the parcel lines touch or it's across the street from either R1A or R1B, the maximum height would be reduced, I think, by 10 feet and require a 10-foot step back.
So it would be 40 at the street. And
So
then
that would
back,
better
and then
match.
back 10, and then up to the full 50.
The full 50 to the midline or to the max?
So it'd be, so at the front setback line, you'd be allowed 40 feet, 10 feet back from the setback line, you'd be allowed your extra 10 feet to get up to 50. So you'd be 40 feet at the setback requirement. And so that would be a fairly close match to the 35 feet to the midline of the single family house across the street.
But I guess what's proposed today would be less than those business condos that are along Park Avenue across the street.
I've been trying to find out the heights of those. Do you guys?
We were out, Jack and I were out counting bricks to
Thank you.
try and estimate the height, and it seems to be over 50 feet. And so I think, right, that's one of the benefits of the step back, is that it would be below that 50 feet. So that's, that may be something that you want to consider, that step back along the frontage just may be something you need to work in,
That's something that I'd like to see. 'Cause I think
regardless
that's-
of what's across the street. No, it's Panera, so we were. A couple of people walked by wondering why I was, but they didn't say anything. They just walked past.
So, but yeah, I'm getting a better sense of like the current height limits around. We've certainly heard from the neighbors that it's 5. So current by right use is up to 45 feet, right, for all of the uses, but it's not that high, right? And so we're only increasing by 5 feet, but we are also doing a lot of other things to increase the likelihood of this development. This issue of surrounding conditions is often addressed in these public meetings. It's like, so this is a special use, there would be opportunity there, and you said it goes through the architectural advisory board and special use process, so.
Yes, what we had laid out as Planning Commission AAB.
Right. So, and then city council decides, so lots of opportunity for public comment on that. Boards and commissions, what's the whole?
For this process, and this was following sort of because it's a smaller project, slim down the reviews to just those two groups.
But those two groups could ask for comments, other groups to comment,
And it is common for other groups to.
anyway. Yeah.
And because this is anything, we expect that anything that goes into these, that anything that would be this high would have residential.
Under the current market, yes.
The other thing I think that might affect scale is the 15% tree canopy coverage. Got to have some land there to.
And they're required to have a landscape buffer, isn't that right? Is it a 10-foot landscape buffer at the rear setback?
Depending on the abutting use.
Okay.
In this case, it had to be less intense use, abutting a more intense use. So, like townhouses wouldn't be expected to buffer a five-story apartment
Okay.
building.
Your setback is
20.
not-
20 is the current proposal.
Okay, I'm sorry, I was looking at the wrong one. And that's what Urban Forestry Commission suggested. Right. Because the tree won't fit, it's going to survive, so.
Right.
stick up with shrubs.
Right. So impervious coverage, did we want to come back to that? I'm certainly agreeable to putting a limit on there, and I realize these things are arbitrary, but I don't know how to do it. Right now, it's 100. I think that's leads to a bad result if that were to happen. I think the most I can see would be 80%, but I'm certainly open to something even less than that. Impervious, yeah.
I think it's hard to know. I'm not an engineer to know what our targets are to reduce our runoff. And I think until we know that, I don't think we can answer this. I think we need to have the city engineer and the stormwater task force weigh in on what are our goals by, our 5-year goal, our 10-year goal to reducing that runoff and addressing the problems that we already have, and then how can we get there with the new development and kind of bake those requirements in, rather than say you just have to do what it is right now, because right now isn't working.
So we would have something like in our recommendation back to council that they go through that type of a process.
Maybe, but but the problem is, you could treat, an engineer can design a big enough, treatment to treat 100% of the lot coverage.
BMPs.
So the question is, what are we trying to achieve here? Is this, are we concerned about lot coverage because of stormwater, or are we concerned about it because of what it does to the form of the development?
Maybe both.
When you cover that much.
I was on it on the form side, so.
So, yeah, so
More of a
it's a
global
different,
problem, though, I think it's more of a global problem within the city context. That's what I mean. Like, it's not property by property, it's how all those properties run off and what that does to our system.
right, but I'm saying, right, an engineer could certainly design a system to treat 100% of the lot paved as a parking lot. They could come up with an underground system and treat it and meet the ordinance requirements under Chesapeake Bay. But I thought we were more concerned about what a lot looks like when it's covered that much. Are we talking about building coverage or lot coverage? Or, sorry, building coverage or
Lot coverage.
so impervious coverage. So we're
60%
talking,
would be the building coverage, right?
so we're talking about, even if it was a unit that was only occupying, 30% of the lot, they had a big patio.
Or you need a drive aisle. I mean, you need room for parking and a drive aisle, and so yeah. The other thing I think to remember is that T-zones are only 3% of the city land, and really I think our problem is in our residential neighborhoods, and that's not something we're going to solve here. I think we should solve it. I totally agree with you. So maybe there's something we can do. I know Arlington requires, the first 2 inches to be retained on site. You know about this more than I do, Tim.
Yeah.
Maybe that's something we could look at for T-zones specifically. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a broader issue, and so trying to come up with something that would deal with it for 3%.
We aren't going to solve our stormwater issues in our T-zones. Parking and
No, but
they shouldn't make it worse.
To it, right?
No, I
think
agree.
We need to start setting that goal.
Yes.
With
Yeah.
the zones that we're looking at now, and then that kind
Yeah.
of starts to grow into the next.
Agreed.
The next
I agree with that.
zoned area, right? Lost my train of thought. In terms of the parking that's required, I think the imperviousness of the site can contribute to the sustainability of the site, which is also one of the things that we want the developers of these sites to be looking at is, are we achieving gold or better on them? How do you do that? In getting rid of the impervious surface helps with part of that, right? So I think you can have parking areas that do have those special pavers that allow water to
Yeah.
permeate through. But then if you're retaining water on site, what does that do to the size trees that you can plant there? So I think it's a delicate balance of all of that. But I think if we start to say, this is actually related to the sustainability of the site, then it's going to start to inform how much of a target we want, right? So if we say, if after the engineers say, okay, well, we can do better on these sites by reducing the stormwater runoff by 30%. Truthfully, I don't know what the right percentage is. I'm just pulling a percentage out of the air right now. But if we can say, okay, we're going to reduce it by 30%, that actually helps the developer and the design team to look at, okay, how do we do it? How do we do it, and what other things can we employ in the sustainability of this development too?
I love that idea.
So what was the actual recommendation we need to do?
I think it's have a goal for improving stormwater like a reduction in quantity of stormwater runoff. Is that right? Rather than say you can do whatever it is now. So if it's a fully 100% impermeable lot that all the water is just sheeting off of it,
So
it's okay if that continues to happen. But I don't know what those numbers or percentages would be either.
Yeah, but we have stormwater
I don't know
regs
if it's
today,
a
though.
percentage of what is happening there. I think we have to have an increase look at how different lots are contributing more or less, right? And how are we going to limit the runoff? If you've got one that's contributing more and you say, okay, just drop it by 30%, but it's mostly parking, it's already impervious. 30% for that one doesn't even scratch the surface of the other.
Here's my question on that. I fully support everything that you're saying. I'm thinking like that this is like a citywide issue, and solving that in the context of T-zones, which is what did we say?
3%.
3%. Like, it's so hard to do this in the absence of like a city
And they're-
green infrastructure plan and updated like stormwater maps and
Right.
like I also like if we're just bringing it back to our goals. I do environmental stuff for a living, and I was in the ESC and like advocating for stormwater plans. So I want to let you know that it's not because I'm opposed to what you're saying, but it's more like, does this project carry the weight of that? Like if we're thinking about our goals, we want more housing. At some point, which engineers? You're talking about city engineers,
City
city
engineers,
engineers,
yeah.
but not project engineers. So we're not acting to
engineers because I think you can see those numbers, right? I think we need, as a city, to say this is our goal across the city. And I think if we're going to say, well, this is only 3%, it's not going to make a difference. But when do you start trying to make a difference, right? So I'd like to see at least.
But also,
Yeah, if we have an opportunity.
Yeah.
remember the people only are responsible for the additional. So the lots, some of these lots are largely paved today. So you're only responsible for additional. Otherwise, you know, under Virginia law, it's like it's a redevelopment. So they're only required to detain the extra coverage that they're adding. So the lot's already like 70%.
Well, that was my that was
right.
my question.
I'm
What is
sorry,
the
yeah, so
state?
it's like, right, so and the Chesapeake Bay ordinance, that's how it works, so you're only responsible for the delta.
We want to incentivize redevelopment so that they can improve. And I guess my question
Right.
That comes
part
along
is,
with
like,
redevelopment, sure.
is if we're talking about small lots, like not these big special exception, which I think we should do much better. What allows for the redevelopment and is feasible on that smaller lot size, right? Like, you know, most of the comment a number of times, like legal costs don't change depending on the size of your. I imagine that engineering costs are expensive. So is it easier to calculate for impervious surface coverage, or is it? But you're saying that you want the city to come up with a goal site by site for each plan,
I think
or
the
maybe
city
at
needs
least
a goal across the city, right?
Yes.
And then I think then we can target the areas that are really the problem areas, right?
Because we don't know which of the T zones are the problem children.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly, because like you said, there are some that are all parking lot.
Yeah.
Right? So for them to reduce it by 30%, it's like interesting infrastructure.
Brent, are you saying we aren't able to ask them to reduce it? Is that because of the
I
state
think-
law?
Well, I mean, I think our current Chesapeake Bay ordinance, I think, you know, bottom line, the other side of the coin is if we want to incentivize development and you begin to put extra requirements on top of it, so you're saying, you know, we want to incentivize a certain type of development, and then you say, you know, but in order to do it, you have to, do
Well,
extra
and-
stuff that, you know, you don't normally have to do under I'm not sure under our city ordinance how much we can go above and beyond the
I mean,
state,
you could-
you know, the
you could-
Chesapeake Bay requirements for stormwater, which is the 2 and 10 year.
We have in special exceptions that those are.
Right, normally you can do it if you're incentivizing, giving them more, you know, like additional, they're rezoning, they're going through a rezoning and they're getting more for their, you know, more development than they can do now by right. But I'm not sure, Paul, do you know that? What ability do we have to require more than Chess Bay says, stormwater detention?
So any answer I give, I would sort of double check with the city attorney. I mean, in some ways, so I just have to check with the attorney on how would that be done? How much of it could be done? I think that's an interesting question.
We
you're
always
right that
advocate
the-
for more. We can, and during the special exception process, we're negotiating and we're advocating, we're pushing for more, trying to get them to voluntarily agree to do more. If
Right,
We're going to
so-
write it into our ordinance. That's the question. We're going to require that anyone who wants to, we're going to put it in the ordinance as part of the special permit, requirements is you need to, whatever it is, detain, the 100-year storm or whatever it is. That, I just don't know if we can do that.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say previous SE projects have volunteered to reduce their stormwater more than the code requirements. Typically that was 10%, but with the more recent projects, that percentage has actually been going up.
Right.
In some respects, the reason they can do that is because they typically have large acreages that they're working with, and they stick giant cisterns down in the ground, and that's where the water gets stored and then sort of released over time. So some of this is also just sort of a site engineering when you're working on maybe a quarter-acre lot. You may not really have the flexibility to stick a large enough sort of cistern. Sure.
That's one of the ways to get some additional things
Yeah, there are these different dimensions in sort of working through the staff recommendation, the different levers here, and obviously you pull on these different levers for different reasons. But thinking about is it building coverage? Is it impervious coverage? Is it tree canopy coverage? Is it stormwater reduction? So all of this is looking at how do we sort of not create sort of like a giant parking lot that just sort of runs its water into the neighbor. And so I think so some of this might be, right, we don't have a tree canopy requirement today for T-zones, and so by introducing a tree canopy requirement, that may by itself solve part of the problem because it's going to drive the site design in certain ways. I am worried about, because these are smaller sites, I'm always nervous about the Murr sort of example in the city. This was the mixed-use overlay zone that was so well designed, no one can build under it. And so, for smaller sites, I am thinking about, well, if we've already limited if we've already set the lot coverage and we've required a tree canopy, do those two things in combination sort of largely?
Along
That's
with
Define it.
that's 75% of the lot, right? 60 plus 15.
Yeah, you could. I guess realize that. I think one of the things. Just thinking through, right? If you've got 60% of the lot for the building, and then you've got whatever percentage you sort of want to mandate as sort of non-impervious, do they still have enough space to do sort of one drive aisle in the back, or are you going to push them into sort of front-loaded parking in the front? And so it's, is there still room for sidewalk in the front? So yes, you could sort of leave it to the project engineer to figure it out, but I think you're right. The city engineer, I think what the city engineers could probably provide is sort of like an overall, to the point of what is the green infrastructure plan of.
Right, which we've been asking for. And I wonder if, as this is just, it is a citywide issue along with parking, along with affordable housing, can we include recommendations that we've been asking for thoughtful, sort of stormwater green infrastructure plan, these other things as well, and T-zones happening in the absence of these more comprehensive policies and strategies, and it's hard to solve for that.
But should we also look for incremental improvements?
Yes, well, absolutely, yes. And I think that, but I guess I think that the impervious surface coverage is easier in this context.
If we want to get something done by February 15th, I think it is.
What is your suggestion?
I threw out 80% total impervious coverage limit, but.
So 60% lot coverage plus 50% tree coverage plus.
Yeah, well, 60%.
Oh wait, 60%
Building.
building.
Yeah,
And then 20% extras.
right. As opposed to what it is today, which is 100.
5% extra.
Right.
Non-impervious.
In the meantime, we absolutely should be looking at stormwater across all angles of the city. Overdue. What else? We haven't done affordable housing. Do we want to jump in on that one?
Yeah. Coffee.
10 o'clock.
Let's just think about other marketing. We've covered almost every issue besides affordable housing.
Well, here's my question, Dirk, 'cause I want.
I'll say it again, because
Priority, but I don't think that's true, and so I think we want to hear from you. Bring it home.
all we have to do is create some kind of like T-zone development district that every single time development happens and the tax base goes up in these areas, it just directly goes into a fund.
Problem I have with that is that you can identify the current value and you can take a stab at what the increased value is. That's fine on the revenue side. On the cost side, it may get tougher as far as what capital costs that are generally applicable, schools and all that stuff that should be applicable, that would have to come out of additional tax revenues. And all sorts of city infrastructure issues. I mean, way behind on stormwater pipes and, redoing that, sidewalks, stoplights. We can't get a stoplight where I live. So, I mean, there's a lot of basic issues that kind of have to go on that ledger that I would like to see examined before. I mean, there may be a delta beyond covering those things because these are places where we already have the streets in. We already have, so maybe the infrastructure costs aren't quite as high in these areas, and that would produce more of a, if you want to call it a surplus that could be used for this purpose. And if that's the case, I guess I would go along with that. Even though I can think of other ways to spend that money too. I mean, why not make all the buildings net zero? So we're not contributing further to the greenhouse gas emission issue.
We're setting our policy thing, right?
Yeah.
Bottom line is, as a city, we have never provided sufficient funds for affordable housing, ever.
Correct.
And so, of course, we have all these other things, parks and stormwater and sewer and the schools, obviously, but, I mean, we have been funding those things, maybe not sufficiently to some people's liking, but more so than any other priority, especially for the schools. And when we look at the percent of our operating budget that goes to affordable housing vis-a-vis any other municipality that surrounds us, we're way under. So at some point, even though we know the costs are going to go up in all the other priority areas, we've got to make a commitment to affordable housing. And I'm just thinking that we want to grow the pie and more equitably distribute it. By making these changes, we are potentially growing the economic pie. And yes, we are taking some of that and equitably distributing it, where as a city, we have not done that. So the other part of it is, well, then let's not make the changes. Let's not grow. And let's keep the tax base that we have and keep funding it as we have been. That's fine, but if we're going to do growth, and we have made a commitment as a city in the last 10 years, we used to be known as the anti-growth place, and now we are not perceived that way anymore. But are we perceived as the equitable growth place? Absolutely not. So we've got to make some changes, and here is a prime opportunity to do that.
Your recommendation is, can you just sort of general, like all the tax revenues, or some of the tax revenue, or just?
Well, I mean,
and then
all right,
tax
so
revenue?
I think we should take it all, because we are talking about making a change to provide housing, right? We all know where the demand is. The demand is on the housing side, not on the commercial side. So we're going to open up the opportunity for $800,000 townhomes to be built. Great. But let's also make sure that, because we're not just doing that out of the goodness of our heart. Actually, we're doing this because developers are going to make more money, and we are going to get greater tax revenue by doing it. So let's now take that tax revenue, that increment, and distributed towards housing that will provide for low-income people who make 50% and below our annual median, or whatever, the AMI. So that's what my proposal would be, and I think that would signal to folks that we are committed to equitable growth, that we are finally willing to put some of our tax dollars towards affordable housing. And I think it would mean a lot for our city and our priorities in putting our money where we say our priorities are. So, again, that's the proposal, and knowing that it's only 3% of the land, it is a very small amount of our tax base that we would be allocating for affordable housing.
Well, it's
Um,
like not
Increase.
It's kind of like a tip,
So it is-
right? I mean,
Yes.
that's basically what you're talking about.
Basically, but I wouldn't call it a TIF because people don't like that in the state of Virginia. You just have to call it like something else. But a T-zone development district works for me. We're doing, you can call it the T-zone equitable development district for all I care. I mean, you can call it whatever you want to call it. But the bottom line is that we are doing development to provide people greater access to our great schools and to our great parks and to our community. So I think in the last 10 years, we have done a lot of development, but we have not done equitable development. This would be one of the first opportunities to do that. And
I would support that recommendation to council. I think it's just important to remember that it is a recommendation and it's sort of a council decision, right? Whether or not that is how the money is. We don't allocate money here on the planning commission. We can make recommendations. But it's going to be up to council.
I agree, but there are ways to signal to council that we strongly recommend it, and that also there are consequences if we make this recommendation and you shoot it down. Because council has a lot of, a lot of priorities. There are a lot of people. There are a lot of voters who want different things. But just remember that we do have some power as a body, and we have to utilize that. And maybe we have to give our council some coverage. Do you understand what I'm saying by council coverage? Because they're going to take a lot of heat. It isn't going to be an easy decision for them. But they can say, oh, well, if we don't do this, then we're really going to have a problem with our planning commission, and we need them to do development. So you guys have to also, I understand that the tradition has been that we make recommendations. Well, I mean, sometimes we're heard, sometimes we're not. But at some point, you got to kind of make a stand. And you have to show that you have more political power. You have to take it. You have to gain it. We have to gain it as a body. And I've talked about how we are weak compared to other planning commissions. It's just the history and tradition of our city. But if we want to start changing things, we have to change the power dynamic.
I think what you're suggesting, if there is development in these areas, it's more impactful than what I'm about to ask about. But I have two questions. One is, so since what you've just suggested is the high impact scenario, in a way, if we want to generate more tax revenue, then we want to incentivize more development in these T zones so we can generate that tax revenue that goes to the fund. And I guess, which I am supportive of. And then I guess my question is, will we get the development that we want? Like, and this gets back to objectives. Like, if we want to spur more housing, do we allow, townhome developments over an acre to get the housing units we know we need 2,000 more units in the next decade, and we need the affordable housing and the tax revenue. That's sort of one question.
Well, it doesn't change the incentives for development, right? Because it's
Well, it doesn't change the incentives for the developers. Do we, if we want to turbocharge or get started any kind of affordable housing funding by this T-zone development, do we want to really take another look at how we're incentivizing development here? Like, are we gonna get the, because we're having, I was just putting this out there, like, we need more housing, and we're gonna have anything over, I don't know, an acre, it's gonna be zoned B1, and is that gonna happen in these zones? I don't know, maybe this is just,
Let me ask you this, the city has a financial model that it uses on a lot of the new projects that come in just to estimate costs and revenue and so forth. And that does try to build in additional public service costs. I mean, if you've got more people, you're gonna have more demands on the police department and, all of that. This model tries to incorporate that, and then it gives you like a bump, here's what's left over. Would something like that be acceptable, or are you pretty well fastened to this notion of whatever increased value there is over what there, that it all goes to affordable housing? In which case you'd be asking other people in the city to subsidize those costs.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the only way we're going to get affordable housing. I mean, this is the whole point. Like, to get this, you got to give something up. I know there are all these other costs when we do development, but along the way, in all of our development history, we have not taken on the cost of providing affordable housing. It's not in our operating budget. We don't have a housing authority. We don't do anything on the affordable housing front, really. So it will feel a little painful at first. But every other municipality has been able to do development and has felt the pain over time by providing affordable housing. We have not. So it is going to feel like, oh, wow, like we got more people here and we don't have more money going to the school. How are we going to do that? We'll be okay. We can do that. We will manage. Oh, we got more people going to the park, and now we don't have any funds going from that specific site or that specific part of the city, but only 3%. Think about all the other revenue that is being generated all over the city by our $1.5 million homes, right? By all of the development that we have on East and West Broad. I mean, everything that we're doing is creating more money and more money and more money, and yet we aren't allocating any money for affordable housing. So in this 3%, we will say we're finally going to do right by this region, by opening up more opportunities for affordable housing through stimulating some development. I mean, the other alternative is like do nothing and then just start going after the operating budget for affordable housing. I mean, but I think we're easing what is felt like the pain because we are stimulating development. We're taking this money out of growth, and it's growth that we are making a decision on, right? This isn't the market. This is our decision. This is the town's decision. This is the council's decision. We are changing the zoning code. That is going to hopefully stimulate the development. And then we're changing our taxing code to trying to provide some affordable housing. So, I mean, I think I've made the argument pretty clear. And no, I don't want to give any of this money for any other purpose than affordable housing, because we've never done right on this issue. Here's the opportunity on a small amount of parcels. I don't think it's a huge sacrifice.
I think it's right, and I also think it responds to what we heard from the citizens. There's lots of comments that said they had problems with this, with the proposal, but if it was really if it was truly for affordable housing, that it would be good. So I think it is responsive.
and I think this is yet another citywide issue. Like compared to parking or stormwater, I do think it makes sense for this to shoulder that weight a little bit more, just to give that place to kind of remove the spurring and to address, start to address.
It's about money. And that's what it making zoning changes, but the reality is that we're not going to get the full housing that we're looking for unless we have money to spend. Parking, stormwater, those things can be done through regulations.
So here was my much smaller scale question I was going to ask, and maybe it doesn't make sense because it really is smaller scale. But you were talking earlier, Derek, about the 4 stories in the T zones, and like we haven't sort of reflected sort of all the commentary by we haven't brought the height down, right? It's still high. I know in Arlington and other jurisdictions they've got bonus density, right? Like if you give us more affordable or more energy efficiency, you get more height. I mean, is that something to explore here? Like your maximum height is going to be whatever, 45 feet or 35 feet, but if you bring in, I don't know, more than 10%, we're talking about 10% already, like a higher number of affordable residential, then you can have your 50 feet. So it's going to be less.
Yeah, I mean,
cost, yeah.
there's inclusionary zoning that's all over the country. I just don't think for this it makes that much sense. And we are pulling the money out by creating this T-zone development district. And it's basically like what's on the books, what you see up there, how we're going to change. That's what's bringing in the affordable housing money. So we don't need to like tinker with inclusionary zoning within this. No.
Would you propose what you're proposing in addition to what's there already with the workforce housing and the, the percentages that are in there already?
No, I mean, I would say that the in lieu is in there. So like first when I thought about this, I thought about we should be getting additional tax dollars, which should be subsidizing the affordable housing in the T-zones themselves. I don't think that's necessary. I think what's necessary is getting greater amount of tax revenue to do affordable housing in other locations in the city. So affordable housing doesn't even, I don't think, need to be in the T-zones.
Right, okay. I was just trying to clarify that.
Yeah, and then what I would keep is that we have that the money should be going allocated to our affordable housing trust fund, whatever you want to call it, but that money should be providing housing for people who are at 50% and below area median income. We have right now in this, in the statute or whatever, that there's two things. It's like 50% and below, and then from 80 or whatever it is, 120. I mean, we should just strike all that out. That's not what this is about. And that was about when we were talking about providing affordable housing in the T-zones. So let's just take all this out and just say that we're creating a tax district. The district will resources that go above what the land value is now goes towards the affordable housing fund, and then that fund will be utilizing the funds to build housing elsewhere in the city at 50%.
Obviously, we can't do that through the zoning ordinance. I mean, the city council would need to do that through a separate action.
Yeah, that's fine. And like I said, this is not something unusual. Like all of our development deals have financing attached to it.
Right.
We don't always see them. We don't always approve them. But now we are creating one to be approved in conjunction with this zoning ordinance that the city council will approve. We're making policy.
Would you say to remove the 10%
Right.
mainline in cash in lieu that's currently in
Just keep the cash in lieu. I mean, or you could keep that.
the 10%? Townhouses.
No. Yeah, you can strike. No. We can
Strike
strike.
it.
Yeah, am I not being clear? Because that should be clear.
Yeah, I get it. You want to, so you're trading units for, so
Money.
no units. We're not getting any
Right.
units.
For a dedicated revenue stream.
Dedicated revenue stream.
Yes.
Yeah.
So all of that stuff can be taken out.
So are you not concerned about the units? Because I know we have units expiring. I know the fields, is
I
coming
am
up.
concerned about that. That's what we'd be using
But
this
like,
money
who's
for.
building it? Where are we building them? Where is that happening? Who's doing it? Like, I feel like the way that we get the units is when these projects are built. So I think I totally agree with you that having the money is a good thing, and we can use it to buy more of the quads as they're available at Virginia Village. We've been doing that. I would also quibble a little bit with your claim that we're not doing much ever anything on affordable housing, because we've been doing a lot more than we used to in recent years.
Compared to other
Compared to
municipalities.
jurisdictions,
Don't compare
yes.
us
Okay.
to ourselves.
Comparing
'cause we're
us
not-
to ourselves.
It's like, we were really terrible there. Now we're not so terrible.
And
Well,
yes,
we are still terrible
we're-
on the affordable housing front.
We're working. We do have the Amazon money. We have money.
Well, we need to spend our own money.
And I agree with you. I think affordable housing is a community responsibility, and it should be something that the entire community is contributing to. In that regard, I almost think just resting it all only on T-zones is kind of odd, because I think the whole community should be contributing. But I see your point that this is an opportunity to establish a precedent for a revenue stream. I just, my realistic brain is just like, well, that's really up to council. So I think we can make that recommendation. And I hear you on, you know, we can just vote this whole thing down if they don't comply, right? That's the threat. But I think it's a good idea.
That's politics. I'm sorry. Like, this is, we are political. We're a political entity. I mean, we bring our professional expertise, but to make things happen, you've got to use your leverage. And we have a lot of leverage, but I don't think we've used it. And now I'm asking us to use it for a priority that we haven't seen getting much attention. So,
Anything else on that topic? I was going to try to get out a way to have us be able to exit this meeting tonight. We're used to late meetings. Well, we're at 10:16, so.
Yeah, no, I hear you, Tim. Go for it. 15 minutes, let's stick to it.
Well, first of all, I mean, I didn't want to cut off the discussion on the housing. Is there any other comments that anyone has on that?
I just keep it as simple as it is. The tax increase that's developed, that's generated from this, goes into the affordable housing fund.
I mean, I think it's worth throwing it out there as an idea. You know, it has merit. It's certainly like in my view, there's a, for lack of a better word, a nexus between, you know, encouraging additional housing, but at the same time trying to make up and trying to provide for a truly missing segment of housing, maybe not a, you know, physical type, but a, you know, from an socioeconomic standpoint. So I'm okay with throwing it out there as part of our recommendations to council and saying that this is an opportunity to take a stand on that. I mean, you know, I don't know if I'm quite as far out as Derek is on, you know, all the points, but I think it's an idea that has some merit, and it's worth getting it out in the public consciousness and seeing if you can build that support, you know, behind it, from, you know, not just the 7 of us, but, you know, from the broader community. So.
All right, see if there's any final comments, or Paul, if you have anything you want to say to us.
Yeah, so we do. I'm sort of one with my facilitator training. You never leave a meeting without sort of trying to repeat back what you heard, because it's you know, it's one thing for you all to have said it, but it's an entirely different skill for me to have actually interpreted it correctly. So I do want to run through my notes just to see if I've got the right temperature, and obviously we're going to check the tape, but obviously I want to say it now in case there was confusion. And hopefully I'm signaling I probably messed up here, so I am inviting comment on my notes. And then staff will use the direction from the Planning Commission tonight to prepare our presentation for the League of Women Voters forum. I know we listed it as a Q&A, and we probably didn't say this enough, but many thanks to the League of Women Voters for hosting that forum. I'm always excited when I can partner with that organization, just because. Anyway, it's a great organization. So,
Place soon and
yeah, we have a spot. I don't want to say it out loud and then be wrong, and everyone says you sent me to the wrong building. So, but we have one in the works, and obviously we'll advertise that. The league will do their advertising. We'll echo that on our channels.
That's a Thursday night.
Yeah, Thursday, February 9th. So let me run through my notes, and I do want to invite correction here. These aren't following importance. I'm trying to follow the order on the notes and sort of semi the order of the conversation. So going to purpose, it sounded like there was consolidation around the importance of providing more housing options within the city and looking to improve properties that were sort of underdeveloped within the T-zones.
Yeah.
Yes.
Those were the council's goals and objectives.
All right, doing good. In terms of comp plan guidance, there was discussion on that, and so I do think we want to at least document what is there in terms of the comp plan. We talked about, and I actually found that there's language in the vision statement about a commitment to a growing community. Still in the vision chapter, it talks about the importance of housing diversity as an element of social inclusion. And then within the housing chapter, there are references to expanding housing options and housing types. And then the small area plans, which are not formally adopted into the comp plan, but our policy guidance do provide development guides and scale guides for development of the T-zones throughout the city. In terms of, and I'm lumping a couple conversations here, I probably could have done this differently, but use cases and uses. And there were a couple things that came up here. One is that through the special use permit process, there are conditions that can be attached to specific uses if there is a concern about potential impacts on neighbors or the neighborhood. There was an interest in removing parking lots as a by right principal use. There was an interest in adding quads as a by right residential use.
Yes.
Okay. And then there was an action for staff to research with the zoning administrator what is a clinic for human care and what is a residential institution.
Yeah, a definition. And as on the quads, triplex quads, I don't know how I don't know what the cutoff this size should be, the unit size.
And related to, you know, the largest size that you can build in a residential zone. In other words, if you come up with a structure that's no bigger than the largest you can do in a residential zone, that is residential for T-zone, then you would have a by right.
Yeah, so that would introduce the 35% lot coverage and then the 35 feet to the midline for the
Although
roof.
you may have had something even
No,
larger
I
than
think
that.
that's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
Again, sorry.
So it would be house sized, which I guess, you know, it would have more units because I know in the staff recommendation you all advised removing both single family and duplex because that intensity of use is less than what you can achieve with smaller condos. But would a triplex or quad, like, do you think fit with the spirit of bringing some, or do we think that fits with the spirit of bringing some denser housing to these areas?
As well as a by right that's residential.
As well as what?
As a by right, it would be a by
Yeah,
right.
as a by right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So even though you're taking away,
You can do something that's the same sort of form, but slightly denser.
right, and that forces lower priced units presumably.
That's the idea.
Quads and triplexes by right.
I'm an
Of a
open
certain
question
size.
on whether triplexes should
Size.
be. Yes.
Up to the maximum and the everything else, or
No.
Limits of what a residential building.
residential? Got it.
Yeah. So that would be by right.
Think of a McMansion.
It would just be a
If you could do it, if you could do a
multi-unit,
tri or
a multi-unit
quad,
McMansion.
it's no bigger than a McMansion, you can get a by right.
There's some really nice examples of buildings like that.
Okay. Let's see. Stormwater setting adding a cap on impervious surface of 80%. Parking, that went back and forth, but I think I heard more people saying keep the one space per unit. Okay.
We add a provision, the council looks at parking, comprehensive parking. It's been mentioned, but I don't know if
It's on the work plan. Yeah. Right? Where
A nudge. Is that-
Well, I'm a
Nudge would
believer
go,
in the
it
work
always-
plan, so I carry a copy around and I tell other planners they have to do it. I like the work plan; it gives me direction. The scale, I think there was a lot of conversation about that, but what I heard is sort of the only definite was adding the step back on all the street frontages.
I think I don't know that I heard that. I think it was so. Right now, the step back is only if there's a residential district across the street or immediately abutting. Right? Do we want it on all street frontages? It might make sense from a pedestrian point of view. Yeah,
I'm okay with that,
yeah,
at least on Park Avenue, I don't know about that.
yeah. So yes.
Are we okay with 50 feet, or did we want something lower than that?
I think it allows an extra, it's 5 feet higher than what you can do today. It allows an extra story, which would permit more units in a small residential building, which I think is a good thing because we need the housing. So that's how I think about it.
Well, it's 50 feet, but it's 10 feet further back on the street frontages, and it's 20 feet further back on the rear yard.
On the roof, yeah, with those setbacks. Yeah, I felt like we.
Well,
didn't
no,
really
so
touch
you've
that.
always got the 20-foot, so this introduces a 20-foot setback where in some cases you have no setback requirement in the rear yard today. And so there are cases today where you can build 45 feet right on the lot line. And so this would be saying, yes, you can go up to 50 feet, but you got to be 20 feet off the rear lot. And yes, you can go up to 50 feet instead of 45 on the front, but you've got to be, that 50 feet comes in 10 feet for the back. I'll write it up and everyone can change it on. That'd be right. Let's see, HCC, we've got an action follow-up with Ron Anzalone.
Uses, sorry. We
Yeah.
didn't Really, I still think we do have, I mean, I think we're all that is likely to use zones is residential, mixed use residential. But we still have by right, a lot of by rights. We're expanding the by right commercial that can go in. And is that attractive over in North Washington? And do we want that to happen without a special use permit process?
Well, so let me flip this over to the chair. We are at close to 10:30, so I would suggest a motion to continue.
I think we're going to have to go a few minutes if we're going to finish your list here. So if somebody would like to,
I'll move that we extend the meeting till 10:45. Always end early. Aye.
Abstain.
go for it. You're going to.
So, well, let's come back to uses because I think I can. I think I've got the others right. So let me come back to uses. On review process, we walked that through, and I thought there was a lot of sort of questions around public engagement and just sort of discussion of the boards that goes through. But I didn't.
For clarification.
Yep.
Yeah.
There was staff report on the board, but I think we sort of nitpicked the staff report. I don't think
Yeah,
there was.
we went
okay.
through. Yeah.
Lot size, I think we talked about the 1 acre and why 1 acre and what that limit was. I didn't hear any direction coming out of that. I just want to acknowledge it happened.
Are we still saying that there's no residential under, oh, so we are saying that if it's over an acre, it goes to,
Especially.
Special exception.
does that work for 1.5 acre, 2 acres? Is that, I don't know if that's the right answer.
Well, that's his question.
Well, I think the only place that size exists sort of consolidated today is along North Washington. And so we did pick the 1 acre. It happens to be a round number, but it also happens to fit the size of the sort of blocks of parcels along South Washington, at Roosevelt, at Park Avenue, that it's a good fit for the possible assemblages. Right.
Which ties into the future land use map too, by the way.
And the North Washington small area plan.
Yep.
Let's see, Park Avenue and North Washington, there was direction for staff to make better language for North Washington.
Explain that.
The residential
Yeah.
use restriction.
Yeah, there was discussion about Park Avenue, but I didn't hear any direction to change
Oh.
anything within the proposal
Brent?
for Park Avenue.
You were the one.
I think, I mean, I don't know the right way to do it, but I mean, I think we've tried to, I guess, in a roundabout way, we've made some distinctions, but, I mean, I don't know. I mean, my view is we should be encouraging residential on that stretch.
See, that's why I was hoping the SUP process would allow for that, but I wasn't clear
I
from
mean,
your answer.
I
whether
mean,
you
I
thought
don't
they had
think
the
that we should,
discretion to
I
do
don't think that it'd be compatible with too much commercial there. I know, and we tried that, and it's no one, there's no market to build that there.
The market won't
Uh,
build it, right?
But then why include it? I mean, if we want something, we should make it clear what we want to see there. I don't know. I mean,
North side's doing pretty well.
but that's across the street. That's not across the street from single family detached.
The street volume should be different from Great Falls, should be Columbia, or to get to your point.
Oh, well, I was trying to hit on his.
Well,
point.
again,
Park
I mean,
Avenue's showing different
we're talking
things.
about like 2 blocks, and we know exactly where they are and what's there. And so, if you're asking me what I think should be on those 2 blocks, I think it should be residential. That's just my view on those 2 blocks. I'm not talking about the whole T-zone world. Talking about on those 2 blocks.
Could we write something into our recommendation that's?
Well, there are some existing commercial uses that are functioning there today in terms of sort of
Office
the professional
uses.
offices.
Right, those low-scale offices. I mean, you know, those can stay.
Grandfather.
Yeah, those are allowed permitted to stay unless they, or, you know, but I'm saying for redevelopment, I mean, I wouldn't be in favor of more intense, you know, commercial development on those blocks.
I'm not opposed to having flexibility if someone wants to put
Bookstore.
a store or sell whatever they need to. I'm not opposed to excluding that option if someone wants to.
I mean, if we wanted to include like something that like recognizes like the scale of like the type of commercial that's there today, like professional office or,
Or
you know,
small craft.
office. Right now, I guess they're office uses that are there, right? I mean, typically there's the, you
Oh,
know,
there's a real estate office there?
right, law office. I mean, they're professional office type uses. I mean, I'm okay with that. Once you get into retail, I don't know.
I think it's more like what's needed for the neighborhood, not like your box retail store.
I didn't say box retail. I said retail.
It's not average cheap. Get farmers markets. It's more neighborhood stores.
I'm just one person, so that's my view. But
I don't know if there's some way in there we can put some languages that we encourage mainly residential development on Park Avenue. And I don't know that we're at a point where we've got code that would do that.
Right. We'll take a look at that. So what I'm hearing from the group is to explore how to write up some code to steer redevelopment toward residential, I guess on those couple blocks of Park Avenue. Okay. Okay. And then on affordable housing, a request to take out what's there today in terms of the 10% sort of units or cash in lieu and definitions of AMI, and instead replace that with a recommendation for a separate mechanism that would allow for a commitment of the delta in the property taxes to be earmarked into the Affordable Housing Fund.
There's,
50%.
oh, to produce housing at 50% below.
So the fund would be specifically earmarked for that, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Right, so it's not a recommendation to stick it in the Affordable Housing Fund, it's a commitment to use it for 50% AMI
Affordable housing fund.
and for that
housing.
purpose. Do both.
Yes.
Got it.
So you'd have to create an account and keep it separate.
Oh, we do it on a spreadsheet.
Didn't say how to do it, I just.
Right. No, it doesn't have to be sort of like a separate account. Like, there's,
It's earmarked.
yeah.
Yeah.
There'd be a legal requirement to spend it that way, and obviously we keep track of it. And then coming back to uses.
Feel free, each planning commissioner, to talk down on it. But I still, like, if we know we need more housing, and, looking at the list of properties, like, just as an example, I'm still questioning, are we making it harder to generate housing than we are to generate commercial? So the Falls property is 1.19 acres that could by right, we could just upgrade, it's already office, we could tear down and go high. I don't know how high I don't know what's there, honestly. But that 1.19 acre lot, it's going to be easier to turn that to an all commercial setting. We could say market conditions won't lead to that. But we're, I think, making it harder for that to be residential if it's over the 1 acre threshold. And I don't know if that's the case. And I just, I don't know why, I guess I'm saying, I don't know why limit residential to 1 acre in the T zones if there's an opportunity to have more than 1 acre.
You
And
can do
it's gonna go-
residential either, it's just a matter of which process that you.
Yeah, it just gets
Still
pushed.
go through this, but so it'll go through the special section.
It's recognizing that, like, I think the logic is that if it's a larger site, you know, it deserves, it requires a little more scrutiny, you know, and should go through a more robust public process, because it's a larger piece of property and.
Well, we think that 1 acre is that.
Plus, you don't want
I mean-
people that, you know, would try to end run special exception process by taking advantage of a too liberal T-zone.
Yeah, I mean, whether 1 acre is the right number or not, I don't
Yeah,
know.
I mean, it's hard to say.
You know, as Paul said, it's a round number. It's somewhat consistent with, like, you know, the type of lots that are out there, but yeah, I don't know. But it's probably in the ballpark, but, you know, without, you know, really crunching what existing lot sizes and what could easily consolidate. But
And I kind of look at this, you know, we had a zoning code for T-zone for a long time. All right, we can make some changes. Let's see what happens. You know, after 5 years, the planning commission at that time, council, didn't work. We need to go back and make some more changes. So I kind of look at it that way. On the other hand, if you try to make big changes all at once up front, then you know, you can't recover from those mistakes nearly as easily, I don't think, as if you go incrementally.
Nobody else is worried about this one. I stand down and speak.
That's my summary. Did I miss anything?
The thing I had was encouraging the green infrastructure plan, stormwater. I don't know if
Yes. Statement that it's hard to, you know, have citywide policies on these things. And then, we have a note about the comprehensive plan. Another thing that's hard.
All right.
Are we done?
Is that possible? Because that's like, goodness, I don't know what's possible. I still don't know.
sure.
We are done.
More authority, Tim.
Actually, thank you, everybody. I realize we've gone through some late meetings here recently. We're pushing the limit on volunteerism here, but I'm impressed with all of you hanging in there.